Hello, good morning. Today, our guest is the brilliant economic anthropologist, Dr. Jovana Dikovic. Hello, Jovana. How are you doing?
Hello, Lieutenant. Very well. How are you?
I'm great. Jovana, what's an economic anthropologist?
So, economic anthropologist is a person who studies economic organization, cooperation between the people, the linkages between people, their organization, and the markets, how different changes on the markets affect communities, and actually it explores different aspects of values, rational decision making, and also values integrated in making certain decisions. And of course, some of these decisions sometimes might be profitable, might be oriented toward utility maximization, but on the other hand, they also can be oriented toward maintaining certain social and ethical threshold of the community. So, economic anthropology, to put it shortly, actually explains the overall behavior of people that is not only rational and is also associated with some economic activities.
Great. And the last year, you penned an article for the Mises Institute titled Environmental and Political Elites Are Destroying Food Production for Climate Goals. In the
Yes.
Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, a special thematic part was dedicated to anticipating the future on Earth in the winter of 2022. And you said that people in the audience, they had three options, and mostly women and children voted for the third option. And I'm going to read all of the options.
Mhm.
One, how development of energy potential may influence climate change. How improving the condition of the environment, forests, parks, and waters may reduce CO2. And lastly, how improving the conditions of agriculture, land, and farmers may contribute to food security and affordable food. Most
Yes.
people, you said, who voted for the third option were
Yeah.
women and children. Why?
Actually, it was other way
Oh,
around.
you say out of the
Most people voted, yeah, most people out of it, because that was a little experiment that I conducted in Carnegie Museum while I was waiting my son who was drawing. And then I was just trying to calculate the number of votes that were given to these three different options, knowledge options. So people preferred, to be precise, out of 18 visitors, only four were given to the last option, to last knowledge option on the food security and ideas
yes,
how
and
to improve food security. Yes, and the other two options actually won because people mostly were interested how to improve environmental condition in order to reduce CO2 emissions, and also how to improve energy potentials for the CO2 reductions. So that struck me as an economic anthropologist and as a person who really built my specialization in rural anthropology, economic anthropology, and rural studies of the Balkans. I somehow expected that the votes will be differently shared, but what it turned out that people were least interested in attaining food security and knowing how to attain food security in the coming age.
except
So,
for
or in
women
the
and
coming
children.
ages, except for
Yeah,
women
that's
and
the point
children.
I'm
Yes.
making.
So
Most of the people who voted for the third option were women and children.
exactly. Yes. So, but I mean, if you translate this into the plain reality, it means that children do not have any voting rights in reality, right? So it's only out of these four, only two would be considered eligible votes because they were coming from women who are obviously available to vote and eligible to vote. So the voting result would be even less favorable. So that was something that struck me. And of course, in a little bit extended version of my text, I explained that this perhaps might be related to, conditionally speaking, moral sensitivity of women and children toward these topics, whereas primarily men, and not only men, but of course somehow people seem to be more interested in other topics, in energy and also in environmental issues. So for that, I thought this would be a good, very interesting plot for a short study. So this is how my actually article on environmental issues and how environmental issues damage food security came into being.
Jovana, what is the European Green Deal?
So European Green Deal is, let's say, a policy that was made in 2022. It collects all the countries that are members of the European Union, and this is actually a policy commitment toward attaining more sustainable agriculture. But there is one but the issue is at stake that sustainable agriculture has to be considered first and foremost with environmental impact. So somehow there was an interesting twist within the introduction of a Green Deal, European Green Deal, that somehow instead of focusing more on enabling food security, was actually focusing more on providing environmental sustainability and ensuring enable and green futures of European countries. So somehow that was quite interesting element in it, that we as European nations and interested in, of course, agriculture and food security, all of a sudden became quietly interested in mitigating environmental and climate risks instead of mitigating food security issues. So for me, that was also one part of the story that I tried to integrate in my article. And within the green policy, there are two particular strategies that are quite interesting to mention: farm to fork. And the second strategy would be biodiversity. Both strategies are actually focused on attaining food security, but through very environmentally sustainable ways. And within that, it means that the great consideration has been given to the reduction of pesticides, increasing of lands that will be dedicated to organic production, then increasing antibiotics, then reducing food consumption, meat consumption, I'm sorry, then decreasing the main pollutant, which are considered to be fertilizers, and so on and so forth. And so in that context, I was thinking, for example, holistically, if we perceive all these strategies, what would be the effect of their implementation and what would be the negative consequences of their implementation? Because the problem is that we so far do not have really very holistic answers to what are the consequences of these strategies, and in particular the European Green Deal policy as an umbrella concept.
Jovana, what is farm to fork farming?
Farm to fork farming is a policy, as I already mentioned, is a European agricultural policy that aims to bring to the plates, to put it literally, to brings to the plates products, food that is sustainably produced. By sustainably produced meant that, for example, the quality of food is ensured, and that also the quality of food is accompanied with environmental, as least as possible, environmental damages. So this is actually envisioned by the strategy for Farm to Fork.
So Jovana, you note that these policies might result in some alarming consequences. Would you like to comment on some of these consequences? And when doing so, tell us, is minimizing land use actually good?
Well, I don't think it's good because I will try to put everything what I said. I try to put and to observe from certain perspectives. So, first of all, I don't think that reducing use of land will contribute to reduction of climate CO2 emissions. So the one thing is that, first of all, we have to consider the overall trend, not only in Europe, but also within, it's a global trend. There is a huge trend of outflow migration from rural areas to urban areas. So even though in developing countries, the strong migrant fluctuation is happening from rural to urban areas. So we are facing with the dangers that eventually no one will be interested in staying in the rural areas and cultivating the land. And also, we have certain assumptions that in, let's say, 2050, there will be 9 billion of people, and these 9 billion of people will be interested in getting food for affordable price. And of course, I'm asking myself, how is that possible if, for example, we have the huge overflow of people, out migrants from rural to urban areas who are not interested in maintaining their rural activities and farming activities. B, how is that possible at all to feed 9 billion people if we are more and more concerned with these environmental impacts, and of course reduction of pesticides, reductions of antibiotics, reduction of meat production, etc., reduction of fertilizers. How is it possible to feed the growing population based on organic farming? Because if we again put this into the context, it means that, for example, organic farming, that's not something that I invented, but it's everyone who is in the field knows that yields of organic farming are between 60 to 70% of the yields of conventional farming. So we, on the one hand, have the huge problem of, if we shift completely to organic farming or to less intensive farming options, then it means that we will have to consider the reducing yields, and someone will have to compensate for that. And of course, when you have reduced yields, then you also have to consider what will be the price of the food that we all as consumers will bear. And of course, on the other hand, the question is, who is going to do the job? Who is going to do the farming? If regulations are becoming stricter, if then you have this kind of global trend to force people to focus exclusively on sustainable agriculture, meaning organic agriculture or organic farming or no tillage farming, then the concern of meeting sustainable and affordable food security is really a big issue. So overall, I'm not sure, to conclude with, I'm not sure that the idea of reducing land use will be a smart solution. What I think will be definitely a need to consider is more inventive solutions for farm use, not for farm use, but for land use. And of course, more involvement of biotechnology in agriculture. So I think that perhaps this might be the way toward more sustainable futures, because I think everyone is interested in sustainable future, but it's just the way how we approach it. Being very dogmatic about fertilizers, about not usage of pesticides or antibiotics is not certainly the way to attain food security, but actually also it's not also the way when you say no to any sort of biotechnology, then that's definitely not the way to attain the food security by 2030 or by 2050.
But Jovana, why would the EU sideline food security?
Because I think there is, again, there is a huge trend, particularly in Europe, because I'm stressing Europe because I'm living in Switzerland, and I see the trend in Switzerland, and also part of this trend in Switzerland is somehow influenced by the general trend in Europe, in Germany, in Austria, Great Britain, and other affluent European countries. So the problem is that sometime back in 70s, there was a huge environmental movement, and the increase of these environmental concerns started to be started to grow so fast, and they become so influential that nowadays, for example, you can't even imagine doing anything possible. Even trade is not imaginable without posing these environmental concerns. So, for example, I will give you one example. I am teaching at the University of St. Gallen, and by the elevator, there is a small plate on which it is written, think twice before you use the elevator, meaning that it's better for you to use the staircase than elevator, because elevator costs energy, it is not sustainable, etc., etc. So to these smallest elements, it shows that really people here in Europe are very, very, very concerned about these environmental issues, and somehow these environmental issues now became a priority. So even when you talk about food, you always have to consider environmental effects of it, right? Of food production and of also of food consumption. So, for example, in the supermarkets here in Switzerland, you will see that there is a growing trend of producing and selling plant-based diets, plant-based fish, and so on and so forth. Veganism is also on the rise. Vegetarianism has been very popular for the past 30 years. So overall, it comes to the point where environmental questions are also starting to be considered moral questions. And I think in realm of this, in the perspective of this, we also have to understand that, once when policymakers think about food security, and when they think about attaining affordable food, they again think how to do it in a morally and environmentally sustainable ways.
Giovanna, but it appears that policymakers are not following the science. Climate alarmism is unjustified, according to Roger Peckel and the review of geophysics, or the global review of geophysics. Yes, I think that's the name. And you're an expert. That's why you're on the show having this discussion. The global elites were wrong on DDT. They're also wrong on CO2. CO2 is positive for agricultural fertilization, and CO2 causing warming does not make it a pollutant. Economic progress is actually more evident during warmer periods than in colder periods over the long term. So why are professional elites refusing to follow the science? Why are they instead listening to Greta Thunberg? You cited Greta Thunberg in your article. Greta is a little girl.
Yeah, that's also something that that fascinates me. I'm not a denier, climate
No one
denier.
is. The climate is
But no
always
one is
changing.
exactly. Yeah,
The
yeah.
climate is
But
always changing.
yeah, the climate is always changing. But there is a trend, as I said. It's because I think nowadays all environmental issues somehow became moral issues, right? And I think this is really very tightly connected, because once when you start, when you enter that film, the role of being, you know, potentially environmentally, morally charged for not doing enough, for not being good enough, for not being conscious and responsible citizen, then you face with a lot of criticisms. And then I think that policymakers somehow try to present themselves as very morally moral actors who are doing their best to resolve these climate issues. Whether these climate tendencies are really problematic or not, I'm not a climate scientist, so I really cannot enter into this debate. But the problem, what I see as an anthropologist, and I really will focus on this more, is that, for example, all these sustainability policies, sustainability calls and cries for this and that, are actually not answering one very obvious question. And the obvious question is whether dangers are really increasing or we are afraid more. So I think I would definitely try to differentiate between these two, because sometimes we have this kind of ideology that, you know, the dangers are increasing, but actually no one is answering whether we, as a very affluent civilization, more affluent than our ancestors were, are actually more afraid of some things, some events that might endanger our affluence and might endanger our good lifestyle, you know. So that might be one of the might be one of the points. And of course, what I also recognized was that you know, these kind of threats, fears, usually stuck within the affluent societies and among policymakers, somehow get translated to non-Western countries or low-income countries. And I would also like to stress that perception of risks, not only among individuals, but also among societies, among countries, is different. So, for example, one who barely make ends meet, is not afraid of the similar or the same things as those people who live in affluent societies. So, for example, the person who cannot feed his own family is absolutely more afraid that they will starve to death than here people who are, I don't know, for example, are not insured against earthquakes. So they might fear that. What I would like to stress is that these kind of different perceptions of risk, I think, are very important to consider, and they are unfortunately not enough considered in these debates. And of course, I will just give you the example. There was one interesting text about Swiss farmers, and the text was dealing with the issue why some of these Swiss farmers that they were interviewed are not willing to accept more sustainable forms of farming. One of those forms would be no tillage farming. And then you realize that even within the same community, different farmers who adopted no tillage and those who did not want to adopt no tillage technique perceive differently, totally differently, the risks and, for example, the crisis that they might face in the near future. So, for example, those who adopted no tillage thought that, you know, soil erosion that is usually associated with intensive farming might be prevented through no-tillage techniques. And they thought that science is absolutely powerful enough in resolving these problems. Whereas on the other hand, those farmers who did not want to adopt no-tillage technique thought that, you know, you can't compete weather, water, and fire. These are natural occurrences. And of course, I mean, there is nothing that you can do. Even science is not powerful enough to compete against soil erosion. So that is something that is contained in the heads of people who differently perceive the risks. So overall, I would just try to think that, you know, I think that, as I already stressed, that might be perception of morality. You always like to conclude your question. I think that we definitely have to consider that, you know, morality and the way how we morally think about ourselves is important in policy making. And part of the problem when they push forward these policies might be in strengthening their moral position. The second problem is what is never considered in these discussions is exactly different perceptions of risks, and of course different adoptions to certain circumstances, acclimation, adaptability, for example. Different people adapt to different climates, to different circumstances in different ways. So I think that we definitely should consider these three factors apart from, you know, providing pure scientific facts of whether climate changing is happening or not happening.
Great. Jovana, as an economic anthropologist, obviously you're interested in the impact of eco-anxiety on sustainability. Due to the growing popularity of eco-anxiety, people are likely to propose policies that are not as sustainable because eco-anxiety, they're afraid of climate change. They think that the world will end. And with this mindset, are we going to enter into a phase where people will be lobbying for unsustainable policies? Like as you noted earlier when discussing unsustainable proposals lobbied by the EU.
But yes, but there is one difference because this eco-anxiety is actually strengthened by or empowered by this belief that you are actually acting very sustainably. You know, even though, for example, the facts, if you or some holistic policies might show to these eco-anxiety movements and eco-anxiety policy makers that their goals are actually turning the world against sustainable food production and sustainable food security in the long run. But their beliefs are constantly opposing. They're constantly opposing this fact that their policies are wrong per se. That their policies are actually not taking into consideration a huge variability and huge differences, not only within the same country but also within the different regions, within continents. So and I also think that there is a tendency to propose a kind of policies where one size fits all. So they think that what works best for American people might work best for, I don't know, people in Zambia or people in Kenya or people in Serbia or in Switzerland. So this is something that should be definitely reconsidered in the long run, because that's not something which is possible. And they, of course, I think that, you know, reducing this kind of when we stress this eco-anxiety, it is also important to mention that these environmental movements are somehow always connected with broader scopes. It's not only about reducing CO2 emissions, but it's also about restructuring the trade, restructuring the commerce, restructuring the infrastructure, restructuring, these transportation chains, and so on and so forth. So in a way, I will be completely open here. In a way, I think that what these people are doing, they are trying to reduce growth because they think that the growth is the main provocator, the main motivator of all these CO2 emissions and the CO2 and weather hazards and so on and so forth, and of course population inequalities. But on the other hand, when you go to development world or low-income countries, you somehow naturally, instinctively sense that these people need more development. The main problem of these people in developing countries is the lack of is poverty. So that's the main problem for them, not development, right? So this is something that they are striving to attain. Whereas on the other hand, you have the camp of these eco movements and environmentalists who are actually trying to explain to them that they should remain undeveloped for the sake of Earth and for the sake of reduced climate change and CO2 emissions.
Quite practical. As Bill Gates said, you will never solve climate change by asking people to consume less.
Yes,
Developed countries are actually in a better condition. There's a positive link between environmental quality and income. Socialist economies are more polluted than capitalist economies. So degrowth will lead to more pollution and less development and greater suffering.
That's my standing. I absolutely agree with you. So that's something that really has been really considered. For example, I just give you the example. Sri Lanka recently, I think it was in 2021, there was a famous example when the government of Sri Lanka adopted 100% of organic farming. And they believe that through adoption of organic farming, they will attain several goals. So they will attain their competitiveness of their farming products, that they will reduce they will reduce their dependence on foreign exports, and so foreign exporting. I'm sorry. So all of this crumbled in the scope of 6 to 7 months. So actually, the government of Sri Lanka renounced the policy and renounced this idea. And they return to previous policies where you have, of course, intensive agriculture. But the point here is that intensive agriculture per se is not bad. And I think this is something that should be stressed. There are many ways of doing intensive agriculture. So there are many ways. If you, for example, are clever enough, if you let these inventive people to contribute with their invention in agricultural sector, then, for example, at the same time you can do intensive farming with the least production of CO2 emissions. So that's possible, and this is something that has been proved in the past decades. But the point is that the very fact intensive and production rings some bells in some heads, and these people don't, particularly environmentalists, don't like to hear intensive production because it associates them with all these negative effects of capitalism and growth, and negative effects, of course, of the intensive production. So I think this might be the problem. It's not, as I said, it's not neither intensification or agriculture, but just the way how you integrate new ideas. And I think, African countries might be great producers and still maintain their sustainable agriculture on the very high level. But again, the problem is that they have been rarely consulted, and their solutions have been rarely adopted in these global policies, because somehow it's always West that imposes its solution to the rest of the world.
All right, great. So we're ending, and we're going to end on a positive note. Well, I don't know if you're going to agree, but I will admit and I will say that radical environmentalists are lunatics.
Yes, I mean, maybe I
We're
wouldn't say lunatics, but I think that they are enthusiasts and they are very big optimists. Because of course some of them might share the traits of lunatics, but yes, I mean, particularly when it comes to the decision whether you're going to have your children or you will commit to reduction of CO2 emission, for me that is too radical. But on the other hand, like if you're very committed to environment, if you're very committed and you think that you're right, doing the right decision, I wouldn't say they're lunatics. I would simply say they are perhaps too enthusiastic that they don't consider alternatives and don't consider often counter evidence. But we actually have to work with them, and that's the main issue. Because if we start or if we just continue to talk our stories and have our conversations separately, then we are not making anything positive, nor for our camp, nor for their camp, right? So we somehow have to find a middle way where we will talk to each other and listen to each other and try to understand the other side. Because for any sort of um, credible solutions and valuable solution, you need a big deal of social capital, and that's the important issue. How you are going to build social capital if you don't discuss with the other side, right? So that's the issue. We have to find a way to talk to these people and to address them not only through quarrels or through attacks or through humiliation or something like this. I think it's just better if we somehow have more roundtables, if we have more conversations where we would integrate with their point of view, but also having them accepting our point of view.
all right. Thanks for showing up again. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure for me too, Lipton. Thank you very
All
much.
right. Bye.
Bye.